Okay? So what we're doing is we started on the story of Samson. And we are starting to go through and take a look at our goal right now. And I'm going to keep saying this just as we go through the next couple of weeks so that maybe we have some discussion about it. If I need to go back and listen to it, I can. But as we said, the time of Judges is a time when everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And it's a time, in a way, we could say we live in, where we have been brought into the promised land, so to speak, and we've received God's word about how to live in that promised land. And now we are waiting on Yeshua's second coming, if you will, and the establishment of the kingdom. And we continue to live in a time that each of us does what is right in our own eyes. You don't have 45 on you. I forgot to give it to you. No, you told me, and I forgot to give it to you. So I moved us ahead for sake of time and just for wanting to get into another teaching rather than going through all the Judges. But there was something else in particular that I realized that is going to be my final teaching before we get into Acts about Samson. The final teaching is going to be, as I've looked at his life more, Samson is listed again as the last judge. If you use this book that we have on Judges and you go to the chart that they have at the end of it, and you see all the list and the dates of when they, were listed as a judge over Israel, you'll see that Samson is the last judge other than Eli and Samuel, who are also listed, neither of which are in the story of Judges. So neither one of them is mentioned nor in there, although the book of Samuel does follow, and the writer of Judges is believed to be Samuel. But Samson is the last one that is named in the story of Judges. And if, like I said last week, if, as Grant said at the beginning of this, it's true that Judges is you could say, a battlefield manual for us to understand how to judge things, and Samson is the last one listed, then perhaps Samson's life depicts the life of a modern-day believer, and at least having access to some of the same experiences that Samson did. And if I remember correctly, I think last week's discussion was, I think we just mainly got through most of page 45, which dealt with the discussion with the angel and his parents. I know I jumped us ahead a little bit and started talking about the first experience we see of Samuel tearing a lion, and we're going to revisit some of that and talk about it. But I think, I'm not exactly sure how much of this we did or we didn't cover on 45, but I think that we are going to start in the middle at Judges 13, verse 17, and this is Manoah talking to the angel that has come and has given information about the woman is going to be pregnant with a child. Sounds very similar to the story between Abraham and Sarah. An angel is sent, a messenger is sent, there's a delivery of that message that she will become pregnant, will give birth to a child that will begin the process of pulling Israel out from under the hand of the Philistines. And in verse 17 it says, and Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, what is your name, so that when your words come to pass, we may honor you? But the angel of the Lord said to him, why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful? And Grant draws out a much longer teaching of this word and draws out much more about the passage of Isaiah where this is found, because the word for miraculous, the word for wonderful is the same word as a miracle, or the same word as miraculous. In Hebrew, it's the word Pele, or Pele, and it talks about, there's a passage in Isaiah that is most wonderful, that is well known, that talks about Yeshua's name, or one of his titles, being a wonderful counselor and a worker of miracles. And this is oftentimes, and it talks about how his government, there will be no end to the length of his government and to his rule. And so it's a famous passage about him, but I wanted to capitalize on a couple other things about where the word Pele is used, meaning miraculous. And what it really means in the dictionary that I have and some other passages where I looked at it obviously miraculous is one of the definitions, but you could also say that it is something that is unnormal. Something that is unnormal, obviously. It's not something you'd see every day. It's not something that's just completely like a normal everyday occurrence. So this is what the angel is saying. Why would you ask me for my name? This isn't something you've heard. This isn't something you've experienced on a regular basis. Obviously, Manoah comes to terms with that. They realize, as the story will go on, that this is an angel, a messenger of God. Leviticus 22:21. I'm sorry, let me bring it up because I didn't write the verse down. I just have it mentioned. I'm sorry, bear with me.
What was it, Leviticus?
22, verse 21. So here's, interestingly, another use of the word. In Leviticus 22:21, it says, when someone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord. Now keep in mind what is happening here. Manoah says to him, what is your name, so that when your words may come to pass, we may honor you. And Manoah's already asked the angel to allow him to detain him so that he can offer a sacrifice. Okay? And Leviticus 22:21 says, when someone offers a sacrifice of peace offerings to the Lord to fulfill a special vow, which is similar to a Nazirite vow, right? When a Nazirite vow is made, a sacrifice of peace offerings would be brought, or for a voluntary offering. So this isn't like a commanded one. This is a voluntary one that somebody wants to offer God as a peace offering, which is precisely what Manoah is doing here. God then gives the instruction of if they want to offer a voluntary offering of the herd of the flock, it must be without defect to be accepted. There shall be no defect in it. And the word translated as without defect is the word pele, which you could say means unnormal. It can't be just a common, everyday sacrifice. It's to be something, and interestingly, the word, there's a letter in the Hebrew alphabet that's literally, it looks like a circle. And it's one of the only enclosed letters of the 22 in Hebrew, and it's the letter Samech. And the word Samech means to support. And you find the word Samech every time consistently throughout the sacrificial passages, because it talks about when the priest is to do a sacrifice, he would put his fingers together like this, and he would rest his hands on the head of the animal and would support, which is what Samech means, support. He would samek his weight on the head of the animal. And this was a symbolic sign of investing of himself. This was something that God commanded to be done, and it was thought of as a symbolic sign of investing yourself and putting your weight into the work that you were doing. It wasn't just an everyday occurrence. There was an acknowledgement that was to be taken that this was a special activity. The work of the Levitical priests was not something that was even to be considered by the tribes as just a mundane everyday work. They were to be looked at as individuals who had a job of teaching us God's Torah. Their job was to teach us and was to perform the duties that God prepared in this. I say all this because we are referred to as kings and priests. And we've talked about that before in Revelation. And so we also should revere and should look at the work that God gives us to do as something outside the normal. Doesn't necessarily mean that we look at ourselves that way, but we should look at the duties, the responsibilities, and the things God's given us to do is outside of that. And we should treat it honorably, I think, in that same way. And so when we're going to present a sacrifice of some sort, then this is precisely what we should be looking to present to God as something that we know isn't even necessarily coming from all of our own power. This is, you could say, almost part of the issue between Cain and Abel in the beginning and the sacrifices they offered. One came from just his own works of producing something from the land. One came from producing from the flock that God had to have a hand in growing. This is part of a difference, if you will. What were you going to say, Tanya?
So why does the angel say, why do you ask my name? Seeing it is wonderful. Normally, if you ask someone their name, you would think of hearing the response, not seeing the name. So I guess I'm confused by the use of the word seeing.
I hadn't thought about that or caught that. That's an interesting question. So,
Because when I ask somebody something, I normally expect someone to say, "Oh, well, you can't hear it; it's wonderful." But seeing it is wonderful.
it may be The translation I just opened up now for the NASB, which is interesting that it didn't print this way on my page. But the NASB on Blue Letter doesn't have any of the words in there. It just says, "Why you ask my name, for it is wonderful."
Oh, okay.
And that may be,
So just a translation?
yeah, it may just be the translation that happened to come out of what I... Here in this book, it just simply, the angel says, "Why is it that you ask for my name and it's hidden?" Which is also miraculous, or another definition. And another thing that hiddenness has in common with miracles is that miracles are hidden from the natural realm. So to speak, they are something that are hidden to us, and the natural realm usually has to be, parted in a way for us to see the miracle. Very similar to the Red Sea being parted as a miracle.
Okay.
And then I don't know exactly why, but let me look this up. I have number 6. Oh, yeah, this was surprising to me. This was,
Number 6 for yours.
it's just number 6 happens to be the chapter where the Nazirite vow is taken. And what's interesting is in verse 2, when it says, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when a man or a woman makes a special vow, namely the vow of a Nazirite to live as a Nazirite for the Lord," that's the word Pele is used in that to describe the type of vow someone would take. In other words, again, understand and consider that a Nazirite vow is a very voluntary, willful choice that somebody would say outside of themselves that they desire to set aside their life for a particular reason and for a particular time to God. So when they would take a Nazirite vow, they would establish the time with the exception that it had to be a minimum of 30 days. They couldn't go less than 30 days for making a Nazirite vow, but if they wanted to make a Nazirite vow for life, if they wanted to make a Nazirite vow for 6 months, for a quarter, whatever it was, they could just, they could establish that time, but then there were the parameters of the way they went about it. And again, that vow was to be something that you would make not just because of a ritual practice that felt good or sounded good, but this would be something that you would make based on a relational choice, I would think. It should be. I guess what I'm trying to get to is this is why Yeshua says, "But I tell you to make no vows." Because the point is, God would rather have you not make a vow than make a vow and break it because of complacency or because of laziness or because of any other reason. So if you want to make a vow, you can, but Yeshua says, for this reason, I think this is in Matthew 5, 6, and 7 in the teaching of the Beatitudes that he spends some time talking about vows. And then the most relevant verse that I wanted to share is Deuteronomy 30, verse 11. And this is pretty common.
20?
Deuteronomy 30, verse 11 says, "For this commandment which I am commanding you today is not to Pele for you, nor is it far away." It's not miraculous for you to keep. He's very clear on this, and I wanted to share this verse because, again, there is an ideology. I've had discussion with several people in the cafe since I've been here in the last 8 years, and I've heard said several times that keeping God's commandments is nearly impossible for us, or that it's difficult, or that it's problematic. And in this particular passage, what you find is God telling us directly that it's not a miraculous event for us to be able to keep them. And I find that very relevant because, again, we should be able to discern between what is capable of me in and of myself, and God wouldn't give me commandments or instructions that he would have to come down and keep himself, as if I wouldn't be able to. But there are other elements of life, like sacrificing of myself and giving to him does require me to have a relationship to understand the correct ways in which to do so.
This is addressed to the individual, not the nation of Israel. Because the nation of Israel was conspicuous by their inability to follow that.
Well, all of us are. I mean, no matter where we're what nation we're in. Any of us are conspicuously known by our inability to keep and to do and to observe oftentimes. But the point
on an individual basis.
Yeah, the point is simply that it's not too miraculous for us. It's not outside. It's not as if it exists in a supernatural zone. It's strange to say that because I often teach that it's almost as if the commandments are lights that are in heaven that we reach up and grasp. I've shared that several times. But the point here is that the specific instructions that he's given us have also manifested in the physical, and they're not in some supernatural zone where we require his, puppeting us, so to speak, to be able to grasp that.
Wait a minute, there was somebody who did it. His name was Yeshua.
That's correct. And there's many other people that have been, there's some scripturally that are even said that they kept them. Abraham, before Yeshua came, before Moses came, before the Torah was given, Abraham is recorded and spoken by God as having kept them.
Yeah, but he made a lot of mistakes. Remember the lies he told?
Well, it's not... The Torah isn't necessarily intended to be a be-all, end-all of exactly what is right, what is righteous, and what is not. Because clearly there's things that we can do that
Abraham
damage us. I'm sorry?
Abraham didn't have any of those.
That's my point. That was my point earlier about Abraham, is that Abraham was said in the scripture as having kept them.
Yeah.
God says that he kept them and they weren't yet given physically as far as at the mountain. But it's not, all of God's commandments are not intended to be like a clear-cut instruction of this is exactly what's wrong to do and this is exactly what's right to do. Because there are many things that we can do that the Torah doesn't necessarily prescribe that are damaging and let alone, harmful to either the community or to life in general or to creation.
So you're also making reference to free will in that point too.
Well, that obviously plays a big deal because you can also do what's righteous. You can also, through your free will, keep God's commandments very selfishly and cause damage and suffering and pain in the world to other people.
Right.
The way we go about things obviously makes a huge difference. So in verse 19, so Manoah took the kid with the grain offering and offered it on the rock to the Lord, and he performed. And then that's actually the word Pele there. It says, and he, it's meaning the angel, performed what his name is said to be. This is another one of the ways that, you could say maybe the word seeing that was in there earlier. They literally see the angel perform miracles while Manoah and his wife looked on. For it came about when the flame went up from the altar toward heaven that the angel of God ascended in the flame of the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. Now the angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah or his wife. Then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. So
He didn't know it up till now.
Yeah, and we commented on that earlier, how strange it is that he's willing to prepare a sacrifice and willing to bring forward this offering to God without even understanding who the angel is. There's a willingness about Manoah with a density at the same time, a willingness to do, but a density of understanding, which is interesting because we can certainly be dense at times, and whether or not we're willing is what makes a difference. We don't necessarily have to have understanding about God, the ways of God, for us to still be a vessel he can use, to do the things of God. We have to have a willingness about us first, and maybe perhaps understanding will come later.
Yeah, but part of that willingness is you have to have a contrite heart, that servant's heart.
A true servant, yes. Be willing to put yourself last, but not necessarily just sitting waiting for instruction. You also need to have some little amount of counsel.
And you have to be working, but you also have to be taking the time to listen to see what God's trying to maybe say or tell you. Sometimes he may answer, sometimes he may not.
Didn't Jesus simplify it down to say love your neighbor?
Love your neighbor as yourself.
So it said, then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. So Manoah said to his wife, we shall surely die, for we have seen God. But his wife said to him, if the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have let us hear things like this at this time. Then the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson, and the child grew up, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him in Mahane Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. So, again, part of the purpose of reading through this text was to discuss anything that stands out to us too. So if you have anything in particular that seems strange or that's just stood out to you, please share that.
Used to be smart one.
Yes. So if you remember, when the angel first came to her, he told her 3 different things, one of which was not told to Manoah. She doesn't repeat to her husband, and the angel, when Manoah requests to see the angel, doesn't tell him either, and that was that Samson would begin the removal of the Israelites out from underneath the hand of the Philistines. So this was a prophecy that had been given to her that she chose not to share with her husband. And then the angel didn't repeat it either when he met with Manoah and began to talk to her. So one of the things that I noticed in verse 23, when his wife responds, she says, if the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have, and then number 1 was accepted. There's 3 things that I marked in this. He would not have accepted. And then he accepts 2 things, a burnt offering and a grain offering. But I think I briefly talked about this last week, and I want to talk about this a little bit more so that we can, have a little bit more of a humble understanding of God and appreciation for his desire of relationship with us. I know this was specifically pertaining to the angel, but if you look up at the top of the page in verse 16, it said, and the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, this is when Manoah first offered to bring a sacrifice to him, he said, though you detain me, I will not eat your food, but if you prepare a burnt offering, then offer it to the Lord. This just really fascinated me with the idea that God himself, perhaps, and certainly his messengers, are able to be detained, restrained, because their time, their interests, their focus, their attention is taken from a matter at hand and put primarily on the creation, on the individual looking to detain or take their time. And for me, this has been a little bit humbling to understand that there are times in my life when I probably had required God to pull some of his time and attention, you could say, away from another matter to primarily help me, to work with me, or to listen to me. We've talked in the past before about Moses at one point stops, and the sages share an interesting insight that Moses stops when the Israelites are approaching the Red Sea and starts praying to God, asking him where they should go and what they should do. And God's response is basically a little bit short-ended, and it's as if God says to Moses, now is not the time to be stopping and praying. Now it's the time to be raising your staff because we're going to split the waters of the Red Sea. And the sages derive from that entire example, that passage of Scripture, that God stops to listen to the prayers of the righteous. Now, I'm not trying to imply that we should sit around and think of ourselves as righteous, but if you're doing the righteous things of God and if you're seeking after his righteousness, right, and his works, then acknowledge and understand that he's willing to take the time to share them with you. And if we have that as a gift, if we have that as an opportunity, then how much more we should humble ourselves to seek after it, to seek first his righteousness and his kingdom. Because God's certainly not without the time to invest in us if we are willing to invest our time and our interest in doing the things of him and his kingdom. And one of the reasons why God would allow himself to be detained is to receive and to accept a sacrifice or an offering that someone would make, especially when it's voluntary. Because again, this isn't something that was required. It wasn't something that was commanded of them. This was something that they wanted to do. And interestingly, the angel's not going to be consuming that food, but if they want to make an olah, which is what the word burnt offering is in Hebrew, if they wanted to make an olah, then they could, but they obviously, as the angel reminds them, should do it in God's direction, so to speak. I don't know how this necessarily fits in anything, but I heard Rabbi Kiva Tat say something yesterday in a teaching I was listening to that makes its way into this, and it is that fire is, in essence itself, and flame interestingly, he said the difference between fire and flame is that flame is the directional path, if you will. It obviously reveals a direction. When you see a flame moving, right, you can see the direction from which wind or oxygen is perhaps coming and where it's going. And interestingly, what does it say? The angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. So what direction was the flame from the sacrifice aiming? Where was it pointing, right? In God's direction. And there's an ascension. And so providing a sacrifice, and again, we should take good sense of this, providing a sacrifice of yourself and your life toward God should absolutely be not a descending, but should be an ascension.
Why do we always think that God is up? Well, I do too. I'm not challenging it or anything, but just wonder why we do. Because why isn't he right here?
Yeah.
I think he's up in heaven. Heaven's up.
Interestingly,
Why do we do this?
I don't think it's as much a,
It seems a natural thing.
I don't think it's as much a trying to denote where God is, because obviously, as you're pointing out, everyone knows God is capable of being everywhere. But I think what this is, and this is really good for us, should be good insight to keep in mind. I think what this is knowing that there has to be delineated, established borders of God's kingdom. And when we say up, we're saying that because in Genesis it says he separated the waters above into waters below, and then in the waters below made the earth. So when we think of the kingdom, delineated borders of where God dwells, of course he can be within us and with us. But when we think of where his kingdom perhaps is first established, we would tend to think of that direction, something above us. And to come into terms with recognizing it as part of my point of knowing that your sacrifice you provide should be something you believe is capable in your relationship with God of helping you ascend to another spiritual level, so to speak. Not as if you're necessarily, going from level to level, but there should be a goal of, the sacrifice I might have offered 10 years ago is probably a lot less than what I'm able to offer today. And one thing I can assure you of, there's a very personal, specific area in my life right now where God has been showing me for months to make a sacrifice after the beginning of this year with something. And it is going to cost me more to make that sacrifice than what...
What do you mean cost?
Physically, emotionally, spiritually, monetarily. It's going to cost me more now as I've grown in my maturity than what it did before. And the reason why is because I'm putting more into it than what I should have been. I'm looking, there, certain elements of life that I am putting more stock in as my security when I should be looking at him as my security. And so the older we become, the more mature we become, the more the cost should, to some degree, right? Until you get to a point where you no longer have anything between you and him as a blockage or as a boundary, the cost is likely to get greater. When I was younger, when I was more immature, the cost probably wasn't as impacted. It's not as if God necessarily needed to break me down and take everything, right, to get my attention. But now things are different for me. I'm no longer with excuse. Like, what is it Paul says at one point? At some point you reach a stage where you have to set childish things aside and you have to move into a new realm of maturity. I think at any age, at any status, at any place where we're at in life, there will always be another step in that direction for us to take. I think there will always be another opportunity for us to set aside and set something down and move forward again into what God has prepared for us. And sometimes the cost is greater than we might feel like we'd like to pay, but if we've established a higher value on something than our relationship with God, and even unknowingly, then by definition it has to be removed. It has to be, we have to make a change.
It is greater than all these things you mentioned that you have to do. It's greater than that. It's something you left out. Again, you don't know what it is.
Life itself is the one thing that we can look at as most precious, but a relationship with him is something that continues on even after death, right? Something that is supposed to bring new life.
A long time after that.
So, one of the reasons why I think God lets us detain him and detain his attention is because when we are truly willing to give and willing to sacrifice, God is willing to receive, not as if we have something to offer, but he is willing to receive the time and the opportunity to grow and to help us grow. And in a sense, to be there as we incur that growth. I put down so we can truly see that he is intentional in what we offer of ourselves, and through that we might be refined. That's what God's looking to do, is help us refine our character, our personality, refine our maturity level. Manoah provided the base means, the strength of the sacrifice from which the angel worked miracles. If you remember, this is what it says. So Manoah took the kid and the grain offering and offered it on the rock, and he, meaning the angel, performed wonders while Manoah and his wife looked on. So again, he had to provide the base substance. And from what he provided and was willing to sacrifice, God performed miracles. That's part of the reason why he allows himself to be detained, and that's part of the reason of really sacrificing. And the greater the cost, the greater the reward. It's hard for us when we're faced with having to make the decision sometimes to put that thing that has great cost or great value to us, to put it on the altar. Sometimes it can be difficult to make that decision when we're in the moment, but making that decision, the greater the cost, the greater the reward, the more God will have to work with. I put down, we have work to do preparing a way for the Lord. So the first, his wife said to him, if the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have, and I put number one as accepted, and then it's a burnt offering, which is an olah, which means to go up, and we're going to talk about that word. And then it said, she said, and a grain offering, which is a mincha, or a grain offering. Grain offerings were normally only offered as voluntarily, as a peace offering or a Thanksgiving offering. And so, interestingly, a olah means to raise, to develop, and the word olah really is an expectation of something that transitions from a lower place to a higher place. Olah means to raise and to elevate, but in its real core, using many words to describe it, it's something that's transitioning and has an expectation to transition from a lower place to a higher place. Spiritually, that should be our goal in offering a sacrifice, learning how, again, to do what is pleasing to the Lord and offer what is pleasing, and having a cognizance of what is pleasing and what is displeasing to him, right? Knowing those things. A mincha means, the word mincha in my dictionary over here, means to give willingly. Now, interestingly, a mincha usually meant a grain, and it means a bread or a grain offering. And then obviously, depending on what time of year it was, whether it needed to be leavened or unleavened, or whether it could be, but it was still potentially a grain offering. But the word in its root means to give willingly. To give willingly is the main definition. It can also mean to apportion something. In other words, kind of being intentional of knowing how to portion something out, right? And then interestingly, I found something else fascinating for us to consider, and that's, I told you before in this dictionary, the entries that are in here will, at the end of them, they have a CM, which means a cognate meaning. And so in other words, this Hebrew word is in a cognate family of other Hebrew words that have similar definitions. And in that cognate meaning of the word mincha is the word withhold. Now, how does the same word mean to give willingly and to withhold, which seem to be opposites of one another? So think about this for a minute. What does it mean? For me, it made sense almost immediately when I thought about what it means to detain, because in a way, if we are detaining God from giving his attention to another matter to receive a sacrifice from us, if you are giving willingly into one direction, then you are withholding from another. Now, it's not as if God is limited and as if he withholds what someone needs. I'm not meaning to imply that. But at the end of the day, if we are giving willingly of ourselves to God, then recognize areas of your life where you may have to withhold and do it appropriately.
Yeah, not give it to Satan.
Yes. Or even time, or even interest, or even attention. And we're going to talk about one of the first and most primary sources. But remember Yeshua's parable of the people who tell their parents, oh, I have what you need, speaking financially, but this is korban. This has been dedicated to be given to the temple, so I can't give it to you. Yeshua uses this as a wicked teaching of the Pharisees at the time, that you tell people that it's okay for them to commit their finances to give to the church or to the temple, and then when their parents are in need or their family's in need, oh, they have to withhold it because the church requires it. And his emphasis is that that's wrong. That's not what God's desire was. He doesn't need your money to build his building. He doesn't need your time and your effort in doing that. What he needs is for you to be cognizant of the needs of those around you and understand and recognize what he's given you as a responsibility in those people. You know? Again, if we're looking
Did he need us to be willing to give it to him?
Yeah, willingness is obviously
But
a
he
huge
really
component.
needs that, our willingness, but the actual gift itself is.
You say need, I wouldn't think God needs us to give it that, but he would want us to give it to him.
Maybe that's what he defines his needs as wants. What I want, you can consider needs.
Well,
Is he could
when we understand, I've kind of learned this from. There's a particular rabbi. His name is Manis Friedman. Very, very popular in Judaism right now. Rabbi Manis Friedman. He's very, very popular. We've watched one or two of his videos in here on Fridays when we were meeting. We've watched a few more, but he is very controversial in Judaism right now because he has taught some subject matters that are very anti in the past what they've taught. And one of the things that he teaches is that God needs us. And people immediately balk at this and have a real problem with this. And they struggle tremendously. But he goes so far as to say things like, what do I need any of this for? Like me as an individual, I don't need to eat food. God needs me to eat food, but I don't have a need to eat food because I didn't need to be here. I didn't ask to come down here. I didn't make a determination. So his emphasis isn't to say that God requires us and so he's dependent on us. His teaching and his emphasis, and this is, I think, lending to our discussion, is if God needs our willingness, it's not because he's dependent upon it. We are dependent on him needing our willingness for our character to be refined. If we aren't willing to yield as putty in his hands, if we aren't willing to submit ourselves, then, and he has a need for us to do that because he's not going to force us to be shaped into the form he wants us to be. He doesn't force us to do that. So he does need us to be willing, but he needs us to do it only so far as what we want to be refined. So when you think of God as needing something only for the benefit of his creation, when you think of God as needing his creation to be willing to go into this, I mean, animals don't have this problem, right? Animals do precisely.
They can't have faith in him.
They do precisely what God constructed them to do. They live through exactly precisely what God designed and orchestrated for them to do. We are the ones who struggle with that, right? We are the ones who can, by definition, through our free will, do things to damage that process or to take ourselves further away from him. So if anything, his needing from us is simply so that we have a combined effort working with him to be refined, to be turned into who we should be. God needs us to eat food so that we continue to live, so that we continue to grow with one another and see what it means to live in having and enjoying the Sabbath with one another, or to live in a peaceful realm, to take care of one another, to grow and mature over time. And
well, that explains why he created the universe and put us in it, in this little tiny earth stuck in the middle of nowhere. It's why we're here, talking about it.
So there were some interesting things that came up to me again, and the other, I told you I marked the word as accepted as one, and then the 2 and 3 that I have marked on here are, she says to him, not only, number one, that God obviously doesn't plan to kill us because he wants, one, to accept sacrifices from us. Number 2, he has shown us all these things. And number 3, he has let us hear all these things at this time. And isn't it interesting to think that of all the five senses, as we've gone over them before, the two that are here are the only two, seeing and hearing, that can happen even when you're not trying to do them. You can see things when you don't want to. I mean, sometimes you can see things you don't want to see. And you can hear things that you don't want to hear. And there's a responsibility, a shared responsibility that comes into play with both of these. And so I put on here, remember, an olah means things that go up. Like you've heard the statement, raise your eyes and see these things. An olah is something that transitions. And the things that we see and the way we focus our attention through our eyes and the way we allow ourselves to be detained when we're thinking about things that are detained is very conditional on what we do with our eyes. How we look at things, how we avert our gaze, what we choose to, kind of environments that we might choose to put ourselves in. And to give willingly is the definition of a minka. And I'm guessing, if not all of you, many of you have heard the phrase, to give an ear. This is just something that just popped in my mind when I was thinking about this. To give an ear means to intentionally choose to pay attention to something, to listen to something. And it occurred to me, as we've talked about this before, that we are given a commandment in the Scripture to take thoughts captive. And what I put on here is to not take thoughts captive, is to listen willingly, to give an ear willingly. Because this is, in some ways, how the enemy works in our lives. He tries to implant thoughts, tries to give us ideas. Oftentimes, when we start thinking wrong thoughts and ideas, the irony is we hear them in our own voice. That voice you're using internally that you're thinking things through, that sounds very familiar because it's your own voice, right? And the enemy oftentimes wants you to be thinking a particular way or seeing things a particular way, and we have to choose to take those thoughts captive and interrogate them and make a determination about the importance, levels of importance about them.
So was Samson immaculately conceived then?
It just simply says, then the woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson. So earlier it said that she had been barren, I believe.
Yep. I mentioned that a few times.
So it doesn't specifically say in the same vein as Mary. It doesn't necessarily, I don't think, take the same position that she would be with child or imply that it would be through that blessing, but certainly like Abraham and Sarah and Mary, there is a definition of an angel being sent, a messenger coming, and the woman will become pregnant. So to not take thoughts captive, to not focus, again, be intentional with your time, with your interest, with your efforts. To not take thoughts captive is to listen willingly. It's to willingly choose to not dispel them. Don't be complacent. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him, and from Mahane between Zorah and Eshcol. So there was something I meant to read you guys, and I'm just going to tell you now what it was. Hopefully I'll remember correctly, but there was something I meant to read you. I brought in here this book before called The Legends of the Jews by Harold Ginsberg. I brought that in here before and read you little stories. And in Samson, concerning Samson, there's literally like 2 pages of information. But something that just always has stood out to me is very funny, is the way they go about, through like parables, the way they go about describing things. Although it sounds super fantastical, it's usually not because they're trying to imply that this was an actual physical truth, but they're trying to imply a spiritual understanding about something. And what they talk about as far as Samson's great strength, one of the statements says, but the one problem that Samson had is that he had 2 maimed feet. He had clubbed feet. And the inference is the walk that Samson had in life clearly was problematic. And as we go through the life of Samson, as we read through it, you're going to find that, yes, he went after a Philistine woman that he wanted. Here in the next page we would read this. He wants his parents to go get him. And God uses this without his parents' knowledge. God is using this as an inference for him to find problem against Philistines. But there is a second and a third time that Samson keeps chasing after Philistine women. And there are additional times that Samson is doing things that keep him coming in contact with things he's not supposed to be as a Nazirite.
Yeah.
And so there does seem to be some problematic decision making. He has an argument of riddles with Philistines and says, if anybody can get this wrong or get this riddle, then I'll give them 30 changes of clothes. And if you can't get it right, then you have to give me 30 changes of clothes. And the Philistines con his expected new wife into giving them the answer. And what does he do in his anger when they give him the right answer? He goes down to another Philistine city and kills 30 Philistines to give them their clothes. I mean, he's a little problematic in the way he goes about his procurement of things, and some of the way in which he's used, right? And he is so eventually problematic with what he sees with his eyes and wanting to chase after his eyes that it really becomes the source of the problem. He ends up blinded by the Philistines.
Yeah, I've always had struggles with the next page.
So
I'm freezing, so I'm probably going to go.
Okay, is it?
I'm so
Sorry.
cold. I can't stand myself. But,
All right, sorry. It's up to you.
aren't you cold?
I tried to get the heat on. Sorry.
Dave's got his gloves on, or he's about to.
Are we getting ready to go?
Yeah.
I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're done. Got page
All right.
1 done.
Page 45.
Yeah.
Page 45. Page 1.
Well, we can stop and pick up next week at chapter 14 if we want. And yeah, I told Jen, I said something to Jen about making sure we get the heat on next Thursday, and I'll try and commit myself and make sure.
Yeah, it is silly.
I guess with my
Randy
pen
over there ain't
and